In this example, we're going to look at a data set that's built into StatKey based on an actual study that was done where there was a panel of participants that were judging a student in an academic misconduct hearing. They were assigning leniency scores to them. And so what we're looking at here is a higher score means the judge was more lenient toward the student. And they had pictures of them. And what we have are either a neutral picture or a picture of the student smiling. So the question is if the scores end up being higher or there's more leniency when we have the student smiling instead of the neutral pictures. So our first question is, what are our null and our alternative hypothesis for answering this question? Can smiling increase the leniency? So we want to ask ourselves first, what type of data are we dealing with, quantitative or categorical? We're dealing with leniency scores. So these are going to be numbers. So we have quantitative data. And then the next question is, are we looking at just one sample or are we comparing more than one? And here we would have the sample data for the neutral pictures and the sample data for the smiling pictures. So we're comparing those two means. So our null hypothesis is going to be a comparison of two means. And what I'm going to do is subscript them instead of 1 and 2 with just a S and N for smiling and neutral. And our null is that there is no difference. So it doesn't matter if they're smiling, if they're neutral as far as the population mean leniency score. And then our alternative should match what we're trying to answer in our question. So if we're looking at if smiling increases leniency, and we know that this would be higher scores, we would expect the mean to be higher for the smiling group. That would indicate then that this difference here is positive, or you can also write this if you want as the mean for group S is greater than the mean for group N. The question next is, what's the sample statistic for these data? If I'm trying to compare two means, the sample value will be the comparison of the two sample means. And we can actually get this value from the data in StatKey. So if we go over to StatKey and look for this data set, let me show you where it's built in. If you go to randomization hypothesis tests over on the side and do tests for difference in means, it's the first one actually that pops up here. And there are different data sets built in, but we can just go back to the leniency and smiles. So if you look over in the corner where it says original sample, you'll see that the neutral group has a mean of 4.118, the smile group 4.912, and above that we have the difference in those two values, which is 0.79. Okay, the next question we have then is asking us about the p-value. So using StatKey, what's the probability that the sample results are those more extreme occurred by random chance, assuming that smiling had no effect? So in other words, this is asking us of the p-value part, that area in the tail beyond our sample value. And do you think this provides evidence against the null in favor of the alternative? Okay, so if we go to StatKey and we simulate, what we can do here is just generate like 3,000 samples or even 1,000 here by clicking the button once. You can see that the distribution is centered at the null value of 0. And what this is showing us is what are the values of x bar 1, x bar minus x bar 2, or x bar s minus x bar n that we would expect if there is no difference and the null is really true and we have a difference of 0. So what we want to do is think about the direction that we have, and we were doing greater than, so that is called a right-tailed test, so you would click right tail. And then what you want to do is put your sample value down here. And our sample value was 0.79. So we want to see like where does our sample value fall in the distribution of likely values. So we can see that 0.03 of our randomizations are in the tail beyond 0.79, our sample value. This is telling us that 0.79 is not very likely if the null is true, because it's out there in the tail with a small p-value. That is going to suggest that we would probably say that there is evidence against the null and in favor of the alternative, that the increase is there for smiling. So let me jot down that. So we got a p-value of 0.03 from StatKey. And so the answer to this, do you think this provides evidence against the null? That would be a yes. Small p-value implies that the sample is not likely if the null is true. And note that the sample is actually what happened. And so that's going to suggest that the null is probably not true. The last question just is, how would the probability change if the test had been two-sided? It would double. So we'd be looking at both tails instead of just one tail, and so we would get a different p-value in that case.